And the organization I was working for, it was sort of printed through them. And although it was my story, it was written for a youth audience, and there were certain things that they wanted me to talk about in that book, of course, which is all part of my journey. But one of the things that they didn't want me to include was my sexuality and my sexual orientation.
At the age of 5, his legs were amputated. At the age of 31, he climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. Today on Rainbow Country, queer advocate and author Spencer West.
Hi, I'm Christopher Rice, and this is Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.
Spencer West, hi, how are you?
Good, Mark. How are you?
I am well. I have to say thank you so much for being here, especially to talk about your latest project, your book, Breaking Free. Stop following expectations and start following yourself. This is the full title of your latest book. Let's start from the ground and build up. Talk to me essentially about what this book is about and what are within the pages of Breaking Free. Let's start there.
Yeah, so essentially it's stories from my life, but specifically all of the ways that I learned to break free and all the expectations that were put upon me. And, you know, for me, when I graduated university and like got out into the real world, like none of my dreams came true and nothing worked out. And no one had prepared me for like, if that happens, the sentiment I got was like, cool, if you do this thing and if you get this degree, then you can go out into the world and, everything will happen for you. And then when it didn't, I was like, okay, what do I do now? And everyone was like, see you later. So this is a compilation of all the things that I did to discover the expectations that I'd been holding on to and how to let go of those things. And then what I did is at the end of every chapter, because I didn't want it to be just about my story. So at the end of every chapter, I've included some questions and exercises and key concepts for people to do to break free in their own life. So the book is really for anybody that's feeling stuck in, any capacity in their life, whether that's in a relationship, in a job, or just some smaller things. This is just some of the things that I did to break free of those things.
You just alluded to it. So Breaking Free features questions and exercises readers can answer and apply to their own lives. Why was it important for you to include that aspect to this book, Breaking Free? Why include that aspect?
Yeah, so I've been a motivational speaker. That's my full-time job for 20 years. I identify as gay and disabled. My legs were amputated just below my pelvis when I was 5 years old. And having spoke for 20 years, halfway through my career, I was working for a social enterprise and telling audiences that you need to get involved with things that you care about through fundraising and awareness campaigns. But I was just talking about it and I had never done it. And what I realized is I needed to add purpose to my job. It couldn't just be about me and telling my story. And so I came up with this wild idea to climb Mount Kilimanjaro with my two best friends and raise $500,000 for clean water in East Africa. So the reason I'm telling you all of this is because what I realized is anytime I do anything, I want there to be a purpose. I don't want it to be just about me. And so that's what was really important for me in this book. Yes, I'm going to tell some stories from my life and some of the things that I've experienced from coming out to really claiming my disability identity. But not everyone can relate to that. And I wanted this book to be something that other people could see themselves in and could also use it as a tool to break free in their own lives. So that's a big part of the book there is turning passion into purpose. And I wanted to reflect that through the book as well.
I like that, turning passion into purpose. Well said, well said.
Thank you. Thank you.
I asked you essentially what are within the pages of Breaking Free, but how would you describe this book? Is it a memoir? Is it a self-help book? How would you describe Breaking Free?
Yeah, I would describe it as self-help or nonfiction. So although it contains, stories like, one of the big ones is being able to tell my coming out story for the first time fully in written form, because the organization that I'd been working for, although they were comfortable with me being queer inside the organization, they didn't want me to talk about it publicly. And so for a long time, I wasn't able to talk about my coming out story. And so part of this book is to give people some of these stories. And also, I do a lot of work online. I create content for Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. And I feel like often we see the fun silly side on Instagram, and we don't always get to hear all of the things that happen behind the scenes to give people a full picture of what our lives look like and what it took to get to where we are. And so that was the other purpose, to share some of these stories, is to give people this roadmap of like, hey, this wasn't always easy, and I had to go through a lot and let go of a lot of expectations to now get to the point where I'm at. So I would say it's a little bit, like I said, it's a little bit of memoir, but mostly I would say it's nonfiction in the idea of, in hopes to help other folks.
So 2026 is Breaking Free. This is, I believe, your second book. Your first book was 2011's Standing Tall, My Journey. So what, and, you know, over a decade in between the two. So why this book, Breaking Free, now?
Yeah, my first book was really more of a sort of a biography, if you will. And the organization I was working for, it was sort of printed through them. And although it was my story, it was written for a youth audience, and there were certain things that they wanted me to talk about in that book, of course, which is all part of my journey. But one of the things that they didn't want me to include was my sexuality and my sexual orientation. And that, again, that was more for a youth audience of sort of like general inspiration. And this book, I really wanted it to have a purpose and meaning other than just telling my story, and to tell the full picture and to tell my coming out story fully, as I mentioned, and some of the difficult things that I experienced.
So Breaking Free has been out since May 2026. How's the response been?
It's been, I've been beautifully overwhelmed by the folks that have reached out, and even people close to me in my own life. My best friend who I climbed Kilimanjaro with, obviously has been reading it, and he's in a transition now with his job, where he's taking a few months off to find his next career. And he was so he was so lovely. He reached out to me and said, Spencer, I was reading your book, and it encouraged me to reach out to my old football coach, to ask him. He had made me like a leader on our football team, and I never asked him what he saw in me and why he did that. So even like folks like my best friend are saying, this has been really helpful, and it encouraged him to reach out to his coach to like figure out maybe something that he's missed in order to like lean into what his next career might be. And other folks saying, I feel seen, I feel heard. Specifically, some queer disabled folks have reached out to me, and thanked me for talking about the intersectionality and claiming those two identities. So it's been really, really lovely.
Okay. Quote, I've known Spencer for nearly 10 years, and he has a rare gift. He makes people feel seen, understood, and empowered. Breaking Free is a reflection of that gift, unquote. That's a review on Amazon.ca for Breaking Free from a one Paula Abdul. Talk to me about when you first met recording artist, star, choreographer, Paula Abdul.
Yeah. So before I started my own business, the social enterprise that I worked for, we used to put on these big youth empowerment events. And Paula Abdul was one of the speakers that would frequently come and speak at these events. And then we would often have dinners the night before or events the next day. And Paula and I were often at those same events. So we just like got to know each other over the last 10 years. And she's always been so kind. And Paula's exactly what you see on TV as she is in person. She's so kind and warm and loving and funny and silly and all of the things. So she was the first person that I reached out to when I wrote this book to be like, Paula, would you be interested in writing a review for it? And she was so kind to do so. And we'd recently just ran into each other. I was nominated for a Queerty 2 years ago, and she was being honored for all of her work and support in the queer community. And so we had like an impromptu reunion, which was so lovely. So that's how I met her. We were speaking at the same events and just became friends.
Well done. Well done. Spencer, Breaking Free, this is I mentioned your second book. Mm-hmm. Writing your second book, creating your second book, did anything surprise you about, thinking back on experiences, reliving those experiences compared to the first time? Did this book and creating this book, did it hit you differently than, say, your first one?
It did. My first one was about, from when I was born up until I moved to Canada. Um, and like I said, it was for a youth audience, so it was fun and a bit more lighthearted. But this one was, I really got into a lot of the struggles that I faced in my life, and what that experience was like, and, things that I learned from therapy, and focusing on my internalized ableism, and really leaning into my identity as someone with a disability. Up until 10 years ago, my disability was just something that happened to me. I didn't claim it as an identity. Um, and, I hadn't thought about this in years, but one of the catalysts that put me on that journey to start to claim my disability is after I climbed Kilimanjaro, I was at a workshop leading about disability justice, and there was another disability advocate or activist there. And afterwards, they pulled me aside and they were like, listen, I'd love to give you some feedback and gently call you in on something. And I was like, sure. And they said, you're talking about climbing Kilimanjaro, but you're coming off as a super crip. And in my community, that term means that you're this like this disabled person that can do anything and overcome your challenges, and that other disabled people should be able to live up to that idea as well. And that's just not true. And they said, what you're actually, that whole journey was about interdependence and how you weren't able to get to the top without help from other people. And that was really helpful for me to understand and to receive, to then dive into this journey of claiming that identity and studying the history of the disability justice movement and studying the key players, both past and present, that are really pushing this forward, and how I can show up differently in that. So I hadn't thought about that interaction for years, and that came up. And after each session, our writing sessions together, I would just be exhausted and typically would have to take a nap. Part of that, I think, is maybe my age, but also I think it was just I was bearing my soul in all of the big things that I've experienced over the last, you know, 20 years of my life, and putting it in book form and hope that it'll help other people. So yeah, I was surprised at how tired I was afterwards. And I was surprised at some of the things that came up that I was like, oh, I thought I dealt with that. But some feelings are coming up around that again. So yeah, there was a lot of surprises for me.
Mm. Okay, the title, Breaking Free. Stop following expectations and start following yourself. Is there a story behind picking this particular title, Breaking Free?
Yeah, there is. When I was thinking about this book and putting it together with my co-author Blake Dvorak, one of the things that we noticed, and that I've noticed in talking with my therapist as well, is every time I did the opposite of what someone told me, that's where everything worked out for me. So I'll give you a couple examples. When I, as I mentioned earlier in the interview, when I graduated university, I got out into the real world and I hated corporate America, and I hated the job that I had. It was just a job that I fell into, not something that I was passionate about, or that I wanted to do. And the minute I got outside of my comfort zone, a friend invited me to go on this trip to East Africa, which changed my entire life. And then I moved to Canada to work for a non-for-profit and a social enterprise, which is the complete opposite of what I had been raised to do. You get a good job, good paying job that's stable. You stay there for 40 years, you retire, and that's your life. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted a job that not only paid well, but made the world a better place. And so every time I did the opposite of what society or my community told me I should do, everything worked out for me. And so the idea is that we all have the capacity to do that in our own lives. From the moment we entered this world, Mark, as I'm sure you can attest, like expectations are placed on us. For me, it was, you're going to marry a woman and have a family, or, the doctors told me that you're just like everyone else. And so I believed that for so long. But then every time I was out in public, people around me would say, well, what's wrong with you? Or where are your legs? Or ask me invasive questions about my body. And I was like, so which is it? Am I like everyone else, or am I not? So although you may not have the same expectations that were put on me, I think we all can relate to those things, and we all have the capacity to break free of those things. And it's really about understanding like what you want and what you need, and how those expectations sometimes block out that voice. And so that's what really breaking free means, this idea that we can break free of the current situation we're in, if we understand the expectations that we're leaning into.
Spencer, you and I are both part of the LGBT community. We're both gay.
Mm-hmm.
You came out, I believe, to your family and friends at the age of 21.
Mm-hmm.
Why was it important for you to come out to your family and to your friends? Why was that important for you?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a very conservative town in the state of Wyoming. And I grew up I was born in 81. And so I was, in my adolescent years in the 90s. And there were no examples of queer people. There were no examples of queer culture. And if there was, it was all stereotypes of our community. There wasn't anything that felt real or tangible. So I actually didn't even know that being gay was an option almost until the moment that I came out. And part of what inspired that is my best friend. His name's John, and we've been best friends since grade six. And around our 20th birthday, because we're the same age, he told me that he was gay and he'd come out, and I was like so inspired. And I watched how he'd gone from someone that was a bit shy to someone that had blossomed and had all of this confidence and just really was self assured and self confident. And I was like, wow, I think I'm similar. And so one night I called him and said that I was gay, and he was so supportive. And my family has always been my biggest cheerleader, and I thought I have to tell them too. This feels too big not to say something to them. So I went to my first Pride. I was going to university in Salt Lake City, Utah. And I went to my first Pride there. And I came home, and my mom and I always talk on Sunday. And so I called her, and she was like, "Oh, how was your weekend? What did you do?" And I said, "Oh, well, I was at Pride today." And she said, "Oh, well, what's that?" And I said, "Oh, well, it's a way for the queer community to celebrate." And yeah, I didn't have time to get into Stonewall and all the things that I was learning, but I just sort of left it at that. And she was like, "Oh, well, what were you doing there?" And I said, "Well, I'm gay, Mom." And she was very kind, and I'm very grateful that she said, "Listen, I love you. This doesn't change anything. I have to figure out what this means for me. But at the end of the day, I just want you to know that I love you." And I told her, because growing up, my dad wasn't intentionally homophobic. I just don't think he had the language to ask me if I was gay. So it often came out wrong and a bit hurtful. And so I told her, I was like, "Listen, I don't want to tell dad directly. So, like, you feel free to tell him." And then Utah's Pride at the time was a bit earlier than Pride here in Toronto. And so it was Father's Day. And so I called my dad on Father's Day, and I hadn't talked to him since my mother had told him that I was gay. And before I could say anything, he said, "Spencer, you're my son and I love you. And it doesn't matter to me that you're gay. That doesn't change anything. All I really care about right now is when are you going to adopt me some grandkids?" So it was really important for me to come out to my friends and family because I needed that support, and I wanted to break free and show them that, like, this is who I am. This is the real authentic me, and the son that they thought they would have is not actually the son that I am. And it was really important that I let them know that, and that they share in that experience with me. And again, I'm really grateful. I know this isn't everyone's experience to have such support, but my whole family has been very supportive from the beginning.
Well said.
Mm.
Coming out personally, coming out professionally. You were just sharing earlier about working for a company, and while they knew you were gay, they didn't necessarily want you to be gay out professionally.
Mhm. Mhm.
Why do you think that was their attitude at the time? Why do you think that was?
Yeah, I mean, this is around 2008. In the United States, gay marriage hadn't become legal yet. We still obviously have a long way to go in our community for um, support, and specifically in the trans community. We're watching all the awful things that are happening in the United States and also here in Canada. But it was even less visibility then. So I think a part of it was they were nervous for me, but the larger overarching thing was they had conservative donors and they had religious affiliation who were very powerful and provided a lot of support for the programming that we did. And if I did speak openly, and if they were seen having an employee that was queer um, and out loud, that would affect their funding. Um, and that was really hard for me to reconcile because I loved the job so much and the work that we were doing was so good on one hand. And I was sneaking in my coming out story every now and then one on one with people. Um, but I believed in what we were doing. And there was a bunch of other queer people that I was working with and allies as well that I thought we might be able to like change things here. And we eventually did, which was so great. Towards the end of my time, I was able to tell my coming out story publicly. In fact, the first time I got to do it was the day that gay marriage was legal, became legal in the United States. And I happened to be at the Met, touring the Met, because that night I was going to be speaking at my first Pride event on the pier in New York City. And I'm like looking through the Met and I get an alert on my phone saying that, gay marriage is now legal. And I like ran to the bathroom and like cried in the bathroom. And then that night got to tell my coming out story publicly to everyone. And then by the time I left this organization I'd been working for, they had celebrated Pride 2 years in a row as an organization. Um, but I think so to sort of really get to the answer to your question, part of it was the time being gay was still taboo, and it still wasn't as people weren't as supportive at that point, and it was due to conservative donors. So it was a tricky one.
Spencer, you were born with sacral agenesis. Did I
Yeah,
say that correct? What
you
can
did.
you talk to me about that and essentially what that is, what that means?
Sure. So they didn't know that I had a disability until I was born. And how it was told to me is that when I was born, you could tell that there was something wrong with my legs. They didn't look like how non-disabled legs would look. And so I was taken to a bigger hospital in Salt Lake City because that was the closest town to where I was living in Wyoming. So they took me to Salt Lake City, and that's where they diagnosed that I had this genetic disease called sacral agenesis. And essentially, it's there's varying degrees of this disease, but essentially it's your sacrum, which is like sort of in between your spine and your pelvis. Mine didn't form correctly. There still isn't a lot of understanding as to why this happens. It's sort of just kind of a luck of the draw thing. And for me, it affected the muscles in my legs. So although I could feel my legs, I wasn't able to move them or stand on them or any of those things. So at the age of 2, they were amputated at the knee, and the hope was that I would maybe use prosthetic legs and get around that way, but that didn't work out. So then at the age of 5, they said, well, maybe we'll amputate them just below his pelvis. Um, and that will give him a lot more mobility, because when they amputated him at the age of 2, they were sort of just dragging behind me. I was walking on my hands, but what was left of my legs was stopping me from fully participating in society. So about 6 months before I went to kindergarten, I had my second surgery, and that made my life so much easier. I now navigate the world as a wheelchair user and on my hands. So that's sort of my disability. It's not something that like progresses over time. It happened. This is how it affected me, and that's sort of it. Now, obviously, like walking on my hands is not great for my shoulders, and I've had to like do less of that to protect my body a bit more. But yeah, that was my disability. And then they wanted me to use prosthetic legs, so I tried from like kindergarten to 6th grade. But at the time, they were really difficult to use. And for me, Mark, it felt so silly. I was like, people know that I don't have any legs. Why would I pretend like I do? Like, prosthetic legs are helpful for so many people, but they just weren't for me. So in grade 6, they were like, do you want to keep using these? And I was like, no. And that was the first time someone gave me autonomy over like my life and my body to choose like what feels right for me. And that was a big moment. So yeah, that's a bit of an overview.
I think I'm going to speak for you, but I think it might be another big moment. One of them might also be you tumbling, you cheerleading, and helping to take your high school cheerleading squad to place number 1 in your state. Did I get that correct? Like, did you were a cheerleader?
Yeah,
Girl, you were
yeah,
a cheerleader.
yeah. Yeah, she sure was. I was leaning into that stereotype, even if I didn't know it at the time. No, you know what?
How did that
Towards,
work?
yeah, so towards the end of my high school, like my grade 12 year, um, the sentiment in my school and from my guidance counselor was, listen, if you want to go to college, it's a good idea to have a sport on your transcript. And I wasn't a huge sports fan, but one of the things that I'm so grateful for about my parents is, even though we didn't pretend like I didn't have a disability, they did treat me like everyone else. And what I mean by that is they put me in tumbling. I took swimming lessons, like all the things that other non-disabled kids would do as well. And I loved tumbling. And I thought, well, I could tumble. Maybe I could, join the cheerleading squad. So I tried out and I made the squad, which was really awesome. But, and this is like such an American story, and it sounds like a movie. And this stuff really does happen in the United States. I tried out for the end of my grade 11 year, and I was going to be training for my grade 12 year. And our coach had us over at her house, and she said, "Folks, like I'm really excited about our time together, but I just want to let you know that our high school doesn't recognize cheerleading as a sport." And she said, "So, if we want new uniforms and to travel with the team and to go to cheerleading camp to like learn new stunts, we have to fundraise the entire amount on our own." She said, "But our athletic director at the time said if you go to the state cheerleading competition and bring home a state championship title, next year we'll give you a budget." It's very like Varsity Blues Friday Night Lights situation that really did happen. And so we went to the state cheerleading competition that year, and we'd fundraised and got all the money that we needed. And then we went to the state cheerleading competition that year, and I did some tumbling and even did like splits with my hands. And collectively, as a team, we took first place and brought home the state championship title. Um, which then, the cheerleading squad got a budget, and the rest is sort of history. So yeah, that was a that was a big moment in my life where I really first learned how I, as an individual and collective with a group of people, could make a difference
Hmm.
on something as simple as a sport.
Redefine possible. The story of Spencer West, a 2012 documentary chronicling your journey to successfully summit Mount Kilimanjaro. Girl, you got your little gay ass up a motherfucking mountain.
She sure did, with a lot of help.
You were talking about this earlier, but what did you take away from that?
Yeah.
Some decade plus later, how do you look back on that experience? What have you taken away from that now?
Yeah, so what I didn't get into is, but part of the reason was that I climbed Kilimanjaro was to like show people, hey, I run a campaign myself. This is what it looks like. I've had the experience now. So I'm not just a fraud up here telling you that you should do these things that I've never done. But the side piece to that was because of my job, I was traveling like 200 days out of the year, and I wasn't getting time with my friends or family. And that is like oxygen for me. It helps recharge my battery. And so I thought, how can I also have a really cool adventure with my two best friends? And so their names are David and Alex. And so I invited them to come with me. A, because I wanted a cool adventure, but B, because I was going to need their help. Climbing a mountain in a wheelchair and on your hands, and specifically the largest mountain on the continent of Africa, I was like, there's no way. Like, girl, I'm not going to be able to do this myself. She's going to need a lot of help. So my friends were great. The first half, they were amazing at saying encouraging words, literally physically carrying me. In fact, one of the days, one of the porters who was normally carrying our stuff had wrapped me in a blanket and tied me to their back. And my buddy David came up behind me and he was like, I just have to say this out loud to you. You look so cute being carried by this guy. So I knew that I don't have any legs. I've got a disability. I'm going to need help getting to the top. But what was so interesting, Mark, is on summit day, the day that we would get to the top, the roles reversed. And my buddies got altitude sickness and I didn't. We joke it's because I'm 2'7" tall and I'm just not tall enough, but that's actually not true. And like science will not support that. But suddenly my friends literally were crumbling to their knees and throwing up on the side of the mountain. And it never crossed my mind that they would need my help. And the one thing that they kept saying was, it's really inspiring to watch you walk, and to walk with us. And they didn't mean that in an inspiration porn kind of way. They just meant we're just doing this together and it's helpful. And so I thought, okay, well, if that's all that I can do, then that's what I'll do. And I told the porters to put me down because we only had a little bit farther to go, but I didn't look like they were going to make it. And so I just stood in between them, and hand over hand and foot over foot we walked. And one of them slipped a little bit on the ice, and they were so exhausted from, altitude sickness, they literally just crumbled on the ground. So it took three of us to help pick them back up. And eventually we made it to the top. Now, the reason that I share that story is because the biggest lesson that I took away from that experience was the importance of asking for help and offering help, and how that is essential to all of us. No matter what our identity is, or where we are, where we come from, anybody that says that they've gotten to where they are solely on their own is probably not telling the truth. There's always someone that has helped us get to where we are. And that's one of the big themes that I put in my book, is this idea of like, we have to ask for help. Like, we can't do things alone. and how important that is. And that's the biggest lesson that I took away from that experience is the importance of asking for help and the importance of offering help.
Mm. Quote, imagine the ableist and homophobic people I could expose from my DMs if I had my own Netflix documentary. Unquote. That's a quote of yours from social media. Do you care to expand on what you mean if you had your own Netflix documentary?
Totally. This was a trend that was going around the internet of a specific audio where people look like they're sitting down to be interviewed for a documentary. But the reason that I chose that is the amount of questions and inappropriate DMs that I get about my disability, about my body. People want to know about people are obsessed with my penis online, which is like so absurd. I was like, shouldn't this be Grindr, not Instagram? Like, what's happening here? Um, and I get a lot of ableist comments too. I've done a bunch of videos on how people can show up as allies for the disability community by not using the accessible stall if it's not something that you need, or instead of taking the elevator, if you have the ability to take the stairs or the escalator, take that and leave the elevator for disabled folks that actually need it. And the amount of anger and horrific things that people say to me in the comments in my DMs is like so absurd. So that's sort of what that was alluding to. And I don't know, we're in this weird thing where I get a lot of comments too, like, well, you're on social media, so this is what you signed up for. And I was like, no, that's not what I signed up for. And that doesn't excuse people's behavior to be homophobic and ableist and assholes. Like, we're just giving them permission now. So that's what that is, like exposing all of the people who, call me a faggot in the comments, but then I go to their page and they've got Bible quotes in their profile. You know what I mean?
I do. Spencer, here's my last question for you, and it's simply this: breaking free. Stop following expectations and start following yourself. What do you hope audiences come away with after reading, after experiencing Breaking Free?
Yeah, there's two things. I sort of opened the book with a quote from one of my favorite authors, Paulo Coelho, from the book The Alchemist. And the quote essentially says, maybe our job isn't to become anything. Maybe our job is to unbecome all the things that don't really belong to us so we can become the person we were meant to be in the first place. So what my hope is people start looking at all the things that don't belong to them regarding expectations so that they can start listening to what's in here. And then towards the end of the book, I reference The Wizard of Oz and the late great Judy Garland, who towards the end of the movie, she says, if I ever go looking for my heart's desire, I will look no further than my own backyard. And so my hope is people will start to peel back those expectations and listen to that voice that is in here that has never stopped crying out for the things that we want and need and want to do. But because of expectations and what happens around us, we start to mute that voice. And so my hope is we unbecome all those things and start to listen to that voice again.
Well said, well said. Spencer West, well said, well done, well written, well climbed, well accomplished. Thanks for your time. Thanks for being on the show.
Oh, thanks so much, Mark. It was such a pleasure.